dust and lay bare the lie. Fill mine with fire, the same fire that's in your eyes. I'm riveted by your glow and the burning that's light.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Refining Exegetics, a podcast and biblical studies channel which aims to inspire life-changing interpretation of the Bible and our stories through unique explorations of modern biblical scholarship and ancient wisdom. I'm your host, Jared Kasperi, and this will be episode 16 of Refining Exegetics, and the title of this episode is Reading Paul Without Contradiction. So, what I'm going to be doing here is I want to give a presentation. This isn't going to be an extremely long, as long as my normal episodes, hopefully. What I want to do is present what I've found to be 4 principles that serve as sort of a rhetorical glossary of sorts to help that helps to really understand Paul's rhetorical flow, his arguments, and the key terms that he uses, so that we avoid a lot of the contradictions that that historically a lot of different readings have produced in Christian theology. And I think people just that throughout history there's people haven't really taken these contradictions seriously, and they sort of wave them off and try to explain them away. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my presentation here. There we go. So, the title of this presentation is Paul's use of works of law. In the Greek, that's ergon nomou. We'll get into that. So this is what I'm hoping to take people beyond is Reformation and new perspective assumptions towards what I hope will be a rhetorical glossary for reading Paul without contradiction. So, those of you who are familiar with my channel will know that I visit Paul and his writings quite often on this channel. It takes up a fair number of the episodes that I produced on this channel, particularly with my co-host and friend Trey Brickley, as we've discussed Paul and the law through Romans. You can check out those episodes on my channel. We've really covered chapters 2 through 8 is where we've sort of left off there, but really good stuff. I highly encourage you to look through that material. But what I want to do, this is really to sort of make concise a lot of what we discuss in that series. And I wanted to kind of coalesce it together and put it into these 4 principles that serve as sort of a primer, a foundation to read Paul. And, well, one of the well, let me put it this way. There's a lot of doctrine that has focused on Paul's writings, or that has been derived from Paul's writings. And whenever you have so much doctrine centered on Paul and his writings, you're bound to have error and bad exegesis involved. And so I want to what I hope to do is to clear a lot of that up. Um, and one of those terms, uh, well, I'll just put it this way: few phrases in the Pauline corpus have generated more confusion and more theological mischief than the Pauline phrase ergon nomu, uh, commonly translated in English as works of the law. Now, I'm going to say up front that you're not going to hear me say works of the law. That's not a phrase that I use because that's not a phrase that's in the Bible. Uh, the phrase works of the law does not appear in the Bible. It's just ergon nomu, which translates to works of law. And the reason why I say that up front is because that's hugely important. It brings out what I'm going to discuss as a distinction between what works of law is and what the things that Paul normally talks about when he's discussing the law of Moses. He dichotomizes between those two quite frequently as uh, in his rhetoric. The traditional reading inherited. Let me go ahead and yeah. The traditional reading, inherited largely from the 16th century reformers, takes this phrase as a reference to the law of Moses itself, or at least to the general activity of trying to obey God's commandments in order to earn divine favor. On this reading, Paul's whole point is that no one can be justified by attempting moral or legal obedience. Only faith, as something entirely distinct from works, saves. I used to find this reading plausible, but after many years of studying the exegetical work coming out of what scholars now call the Paul within Judaism trajectory, and comparing it seriously with Reformed, Catholic, and New Perspective scholarship, I have come to see previous readings as fundamentally mistaken, not just slightly off, but wrong in a way that forces Paul to contradict himself at almost every turn, and more seriously misrepresents what the gospel actually is. What I want to do in this essay is lay out, as carefully and clearly as I can, four interlocking principles that serve as a rhetorical glossary of sorts that helps avoid confusion when reading Paul. Uh, so I'll briefly go through those principles. Well, I'll name them here. First, first principle is that works of law or law and works. Sometimes Paul shortens the moniker works of law to just law or even just works. And this, in Paul's polemical context, refers to man made regulations that exist outside of and in addition to the law of Moses, not to the law of Moses itself. Second, that these regulations do not merely fail to produce righteousness, but actively lead people to violate the law of Moses. Thirdly, that this and not some general impossibility of human obedience is precisely why no one is justified by works of law or law. And fourth, that justification by faith in Paul is separable from actually doing the law. So these 4 points are not separate ideas, they form a single coherent guide to Paul's diction. So a key question at this point that I want to introduce and that we're going to return to throughout this presentation is, can Romans 2:13 and Romans 3:20 both be true? Now, Romans 2:13 says, "It is not the hearers of the law who will be righteous before God, but it is the doers of the law who will be justified." And then the next chapter, Romans 3, verse 20, Paul says, "By works of law, no flesh shall be justified." Uh, I've presented this question many times to people, and I rarely get a straightforward answer about uh, how they would reconcile these two passages. Uh, and I presented to people who see no dichotomy between works of law and doing the law. I contend throughout this presentation that there is such a dichotomy, and that that's the reason why Paul can say in one chapter that it's the doers of the law who will be justified before God, and in the next chapter say, "By works of law, no flesh shall be justified." That's not a contradiction because those are two different things. And I hope that as this presentation, as we go through it, that you'll be convinced just as I have been. So a lot of the sources that I'm working off of this, I'm not making any of this up. I am sort of going a little more forward and maybe building upon what scholars like Dr. Mark Nanos, Matthew Thiessen, and M.I. Cha, as well as Dr. Daniel Lancaster, and a few others within this Paul Within Judaism trajectory of scholarship. Uh, I'm I'm really just seeking to build off of the work that they've done, uh, and so let's go to section. Let's see. So here are the four principles. That works of law equals man-made regulations. Ergon nomu does not equal the Torah. And it's the grammar and historical context, and even what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls that helps to lead to this conclusion. So let's talk about principle one. They refer to man-made regulations outside of the law of Moses. The first and most fundamental claim, well, I don't need to restate it, but let me start with the Greek. Paul uses ergon nomu exactly 5 times in all of Scripture, and every single occurrence is in his own writing. This is not a common idiom from the Hebrew Bible or from Second Temple Jewish literature in general, but it does appear in a strikingly similar Hebrew form in a couple places in a couple documents found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically in the document scholars call 4Q MMT. That designation means it was found in Cave 4 of the Qumran caves, and the title MMT is abbreviation for Mixat Mahaseh HaTorah, which loosely translates to some precepts of the Torah. Since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s, it has become undeniable that this phrase belongs to the technical vocabulary of highly sectarian Jewish communities and refers specifically to their own halachic rulings. Halachic, when I say halakha or halachic, it's just a Hebrew term in regards to, it translates to the way one walks. And in Jewish discourse, it's in regards to interpretation of the law that leads to instruction on how to walk out the commandments. So these regulations were centered around ritual purity and regulating membership. So this opened the door to a huge paradigm shift in understanding Paul's original context. The Paul Within Judaism scholars such as Mark Nanos and Matthew Thiessen have since demonstrated this in exhaustive detail, and I find their exegetical work far more accurate on this topic than either the traditional Reformed reading or even the new perspective on Paul. One of the most consistent grammatical features of Paul's letters is that when he speaks of works of law, in a negative polemical sense, the thing that does not and cannot justify, he almost always leaves out the Greek definite article before nomu. You don't find, just as in the phrase works of law, it's not ergon tu nomu, and when we find just nomu by itself, we don't see tu nomu or ho nomos. This signals grammatically a distinction. So he writes ergon nomu, not ergon tu nomu. This is not accidental. Paul is remarkably consistent about this throughout both Galatians and Romans. When he refers to the law of Moses, the actual Torah, he almost always uses the arthrous form, tu nomu or ho nomos, with the definite article. So for instance, we could look at Romans 3:21, for a righteousness has been revealed from heaven that is apart from nomu. Notice no definite article. And then he goes on to say, to which the law, it's tu nomu, with the definite article, and the prophets testify. Read this way, when we hold a distinction between the two, where nomu by itself just refers to man-made regulations that he just said don't justify in the previous verse, there's no contradiction within Romans 3:21 itself. But if you conflate works of law with the law, then you wind up with Paul basically saying that there's a righteousness that is attested to and declared in the law and the prophets, and yet it's also apart from the law and the prophets. That doesn't make any sense. And I think we just need to we need to take that seriously, and we can't gloss or just sweep that aside. That is a contradiction if we read it that way. You only get that contradiction if you collapse the two terms together, which most English translations unfortunately do. By inserting the before law throughout these passages, they create ambiguity where Paul intended clarity. The same distinction appears throughout Galatians. In chapter 4, verse 21, Paul addresses those who want to be under law, a phrase he clearly contrasts with doing the law, i.e., the Torah. Again, English translations gloss that phrase in verse 21, and they render it as you who want to be under the law. Well, it's not under the law, it's just under law. Well, what law has Paul been talking about? Well, it's the law of this circumcision party, this dogma, this doctrine that they're bringing that sets up a dividing wall of hostility. So, the nomos, without a definite article in these polemical sections, refers not to God's written law, but to the sectarian body of oral traditions and halakhic regulations that certain groups within Judaism were imposing on Gentile believers. In Romans 2, Paul's Jewish interlocutor, quote, boasts in law, verse 23. It's anarthrous, denoting man-made tradition. Again, that's the way that I'm setting forth a guide. You can test it. You can see if it brings clarity to your reading of Paul. I contend that it does, because he says this interlocutor, quote, boasts in law while transgressing the law. And that second nomos in verse 23 is arthrous. These are two entirely different things in Paul's argument. How could someone boast in the Torah while transgressing the Torah? I wouldn't be able to boast in loving God if I'm not loving God. It just rhetorically that doesn't make any sense. But rhetorically it does make sense if this interlocutor, this Jew, is relying on something that invents a righteousness of their own that's actually a violation of the commandments. So that would make sense rhetorically. And we could also talk about the Greek word grammaton or grammatos in places like Romans 2:27 and 7:6. This word gets translated and glossed over a lot too. It gets rendered in English translations as the letter of the law or the written code, but it just means letter, really. This term deserves special attention. Many theological systems have been built on the supposed contrast between, quote, the letter of the law and, quote, the spirit of the law, as though Paul were saying that literal obedience to the Torah's specific commands is wrong-headed, while some vague, more spiritualized form of moral guidance is what God really wants. But the phrase letter of the law never appears in the Bible, and Paul never constructs that dichotomy. When Paul uses the singular or plural of gramma by itself, he is using it as a technical term, again, like works of law, for man-made ordinances and regulations. In Romans 2:27 and 7:6 and 2 Corinthians 3:6 through 7, grammar refers to these man-made written codes, not to the Torah of Moses, which Paul explicitly calls pneumatikos, or spiritual. You can read that in Romans 7:14. Paul says that the law is spiritual, but I am in the flesh. And he goes on in Romans 8. When we follow these arguments, he makes statements that the person who sets their mind on the flesh does not submit to God's law, nor can he. And then he goes on to say later on that those who walk according to the Spirit do submit to God's righteousness. They don't seek to create a righteousness of their own, inventing their own standards, their own traditions, and then claiming justification through those things. No, God has already revealed his righteousness, and it's through that righteousness that we're justified. When we obey his instructions, his commandments, we don't seek to establish our own, then we submit to God's law, not our own regulations. To even entertain the idea that letter here has anything to do with the law of Moses is to misread Paul fundamentally. So what concretely were these works of law? In both Galatians and Romans, the evidence points to a body of halakhic regulations belonging to one or more highly sectarian groups of Jews. These groups believed themselves to be the true Israel, the true children of Abraham, and the ones who alone would have a place in the age to come. When we look at the community rule document and 4QMT in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we see this phrase come up, it's in the context of a teacher of righteousness or a certain leaders writing to a group of Jews to persuade them that their understanding of the commandments and their walking out and their regulations are what truly will mark them out as real Jews. These are sectarian groups that don't even consider the Judean Jews as true Israelites or true Jews, because they're not adhering to these strict regulations. So it's to mark out a community by self-identifying through regulations. And the centerpiece of their practice, the mark without which, in their view, no one could be considered a covenant member, was circumcision. Go figure. Not circumcision as simply commanded in the Torah for the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but ritual circumcision as the initiation into their particular community rule, the culmination of a full proselyte conversion process that transformed a Gentile into a Jew. So circumcision, one of the things that I never, or that I was dissatisfied with the new perspective on Paul. I know that that's popular and that seems to be sort of the newer thing. The reason why that didn't satisfy me when I read Paul is because Paul talks about circumcision. He doesn't talk about these four things that the new perspective on Paul seemed to focus on: circumcision, food laws, the Sabbath, and the feasts. Paul talks about circumcision. It's always circumcision. Why is that? He doesn't mention kosher laws. He doesn't mention the Sabbath as something that was the issue here. And that's because historically, circumcision in Paul, it really stood for a synecdoche or a metonym for this entire process of turning a Gentile into a Jew. Compelling a Gentile to Judaize, become a Jew, basically, is what that is, through circumcision. This is why, if you simply count the number of times the word circumcision appears in Galatians, you will find that it dominates the letter from beginning to end. Paul never calls his opponents the Mosaic party or the Mosaic Law Party, or the Sabbath and Dietary Laws Party. He calls them the Circumcision Party in Galatians 2:12. Their singular doctrine, the one they troubled Gentile believers with, was, quote, "Unless you are circumcised according to our oral traditions, you cannot be saved. Nor can you be considered a full and equal member with Israel." This and nothing else is what Paul means by works of law. It was not about keeping the Sabbath, not about dietary restrictions, not about the annual feasts. It was Gentile believers were already keeping those things. The so-called Judaizers were not called the Circumcision Sabbath and Kosher Law Party. They were called the Circumcision Party. Paul uses circumcision as the singular polemical focus because that is precisely what is at stake. Furthermore, and this point is worth stressing, if works of law refer to the law of Moses itself, then Paul's rhetorical address to the Galatians makes no sense at all. He tells them they are in danger of being re-enslaved to weak and beggarly elemental principles. He talks about that in Galatians 4, around 7, 8, 9. But the Galatian Gentile believers had never been under the law of Moses to begin with. They were pagans. They were strangers to the covenants and the promises and the law. It would be absurd for Paul to warn them against going back to the law of Moses when they had never been under it to begin with. What they had been enslaved to, formerly, were pagan cult festivals revolving around astrological ritual, days and months and seasons and years, right? Galatians 4:10. And what Paul warns them against is a Jewish sectarian form of the same kind of flesh-oriented bondage, a man-made system that boasts an outward marks on the body, just as their former paganism boasted in outward rituals performed before idols. And so this leads to principle 2. Works of law leads people to violate the law. So these aren't Torah observances. These are things that actually undermine the commandments of God and set them aside. This is Paul's actual argument, in Galatians 3:10, and in the parallel arguments in Romans, and once you see it, everything clicks into place. Paul quotes Deuteronomy 27:26 in Galatians 3:10. "Cursed is everyone who does not remain in all the things written in the book of the law to do them." The traditional reading interprets this as saying that trying to do the law puts you under a curse because the law demands perfect performance and no one can achieve it. But this is precisely the opposite of what the verse says. Deuteronomy 27:26 does not pronounce a curse on those who attempt to do the law. It pronounces a curse on those who do not do it, who set it aside. So when Paul applies this curse to those who are of, quote, works of law, his point cannot be doing the law curses you. His point must be that being of works of law is a way of not doing the law. In other words, it's a way of setting aside the law and violating the law. And therefore, those who rely on it fall under the curse declared against those who set the law aside. This is the exegetical key. Those who are of works of law are under a curse not because they are trying too hard to obey, but because their works of law constitute a transgression of the book of the law. Paul confirms this explicitly in Galatians 6:13. Those troublers who rely on works of law don't themselves keep the law. And in Romans 2:17-27, Paul's Jewish interlocutor who, quote, boasts in law while breaking the law is presented as the paradigm case. He relies on a man-made tradition, the bare fact of his circumcision in the flesh, apart from actually doing what the Torah requires, and that reliance itself constitutes a violation of God's law. Hence why Paul goes on to say in verse 27 that you who through circumcision and the letter, there's that word grammaton, are a transgressor of the law. So it's not that he's, though he's trying to do the law, he's transgressing the law. That's not Paul's argument at all. He's saying that through circumcision and grammaton, he's a transgressor. That's think about that for a moment. Um, it's through doing something that's setting aside the law, something else, something that he's invented or has placed his reliance upon. It's through that he's a transgressor of the law. So there are several reasons why works of law leads to this violation. The most immediate is that the practice of requiring Gentiles to be circumcised in order to become Jews is something the law of Moses never commanded. I want to be precise here because this is often misunderstood. There are exactly 2 instances in the Hebrew Scriptures where a Gentile is instructed to be circumcised. First, in Genesis 17, where Abraham is told to circumcise any household slave who becomes part of his household. A Gentile who literally shed his prior identity and became as a native-born Israelite in the family. That's what a household slave essentially becomes, is they lose their identity and they become actually part of that household as a member. Now, certainly there's a hierarchy, a structure of authority and position within that, but yet they are considered part of that family and therefore required to take on themselves the mark of an Israelite, a physical descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And second, in Exodus 12, where a foreigner in their midst who wishes to eat of the Passover lamb is required to first be circumcised. The reason being is because the Passover lamb memorializes God's deliverance of his firstborn son, Israel. Yes, there were a mixed multitude who came out of Egypt with Israel, who supposedly saw the works of God and saw that God was with Israel. So they're like, well, we want to be with you. Looks like God has destroyed Egypt and its gods, and so we want to serve your God. So we'll come along with you, is sort of the idea there. But they're not the firstborn. They're not physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Israelites are, but you have foreigners that have attached themselves to the people of Israel as one assembly. But it would be presumptuous for such a foreigner who doesn't carry the mark of the firstborn to eat of the memorial meal, the lamb that memorializes God's deliverance of his firstborn. That's it. Just those 2 situations. Now, the foreigner in the midst is not required to eat the Passover lamb. It says if he wishes to eat it. But that's also not the only part of Passover. It's not like the Passover just involves eating a lamb. The Passover is an observance. It's a night of waiting, of watching. It doesn't preclude this uncircumcised foreigner's participation in the rest of the covenant stipulations. It assumes that there are uncircumcised foreigners in the midst of the assembly. Otherwise, it wouldn't require them to be circumcised to do this thing. They would have been circumcised already. It's sort of redundant if that was the case. So nowhere does the Torah say, quote, if a Gentile dwelling with you wants to be saved or wants to be a covenant member, you must circumcise him so he becomes an Israelite. Nowhere does it say that. Nowhere does it say that a Gentile who is not circumcised cannot be a full covenant member. The Torah, in fact, frequently assumes that there are uncircumcised members of the community. The ger dwelling in their midst, or the sojourners is often what they're called, who have attached themselves to Israel, who are participants in the covenant stipulations. You have 3 chapters of Leviticus 17, 18, and 19 that give instruction after instruction and qualify them with the qualifier, there shall be one instruction for both for the native-born Israelite and the sojourner in your midst. These are uncircumcised sojourners, and they are covenant members. Therefore, they have instructions that they share with native Israelites and other instructions that they don't share, but that doesn't mean they're not in covenant. There's differing instructions, things that apply to different situations. So the assembly that left Egypt was not composed only of circumcised Israelites, but included a mixed multitude of uncircumcised foreigners who were never commanded to be circumcised before joining God's people. Isaiah 56 gives a striking pronouncement in which God promises to give a foreigner who desires to enter his covenant a place better than a son, without ever mentioning circumcision as a requirement. What is mentioned is, if he keeps my Sabbath and doesn't profane it and holds fast to my covenant. That's Yod He Vav He. That's Hashem speaking there and saying that a foreigner who doesn't mention circumcision. In fact, even a eunuch. um, this is someone who basically have uh, no possibility of getting circumcised. Uh, has a place in this covenant if they keep the Lord's Sabbath and His covenants. Interesting, huh? So the requirement being imposed on Gentile believers by the circumcision party was not from the Torah. It was a custom. So, for instance, Acts 15:1, Luke uses the phrase "custom of Moses," not commandment of Moses. Customs are passed down through tradition, not written down as statutes. The law of Moses was written down. Oral traditions are not the law of Moses, even when they claim to be derived from it. As E.P. Sanders showed in his foundational work on Paul and Palestinian Judaism, groups like the Qumran sect pledged to keep every commandment of the law of Moses in accordance with all that has been revealed to the sons of Zadok. In other words, their sectarian regulations formally claimed to be in the law of Moses, even though they were additions, modifications, and deletions. This is exactly what Paul is fighting. The result is that the circumcision party was doing precisely what they accused others of doing, violating the book of the law. By teaching that Gentiles must be circumcised to become Jews in order to be saved, they were setting aside the promise to Abraham, because if all the nations must become Jews, then there are no longer all the nations to receive blessings. The promise has been emptied. Now, let me say that again. This needs to be really understood. The reason why Paul opposed works of law and the circumcising of Gentiles through this proselyte regulation to become Jews, it empties the promise. It nullifies the promise, because the promise to Abraham was, in you and in your seed, all the peoples, all the nations, all the Gentiles shall be blessed. Well, there wouldn't be any Gentiles if they all become Jews. So again, that's a violation of not only of the law of Moses, but it's a nullifying of the promise. The promise to Abraham in the gospel was never that all the nations would turn into Jews and then we'd all be Jews. But that's exactly what the dogma that's being foisted upon the Gentiles is saying. That's what it reasons from. So they were building a dividing wall of hostility between the circumcised and the uncircumcised, when the law and the prophets never erected such a wall. They were, in short, creating, quote, a righteousness of their own, not in the sense of trying too hard to be moral, but in the sense of inventing a standard for covenant membership that neither God commanded nor the Torah taught. This is also why Jesus himself battled these oral traditions during his earthly ministry. Matthew 15:9 and Mark 7:1-7 present him directly confronting, quote, the precepts and teachings of men that have been set up as if they were the law. That's where we get the you hear this is a familiar phrase. You set at naught the commandments of God so that you can practice your traditions. That's pretty much exactly what Paul's fighting. So these are the same traditions of the elders that had actually set aside the commandments of God. Jesus opposed them not because he was against the law, but because he was for it, and because these traditions were being used to nullify it. Let's see. One further consequence of works of law is worth noting here. They led the troublers themselves, and those who fell in with them, into the very deeds of the flesh Paul catalogues in Galatians 5:19-21 and 6-8. or 6:8. Division, rivalry, fractions, and biting and devouring one another. That's critical. Works of law could not be the law of Moses because they're things that cause factions. They are things that cause divisions and rivalries and biting and devouring one another. That's why Paul says in Galatians 5:3, you who would be circumcised, uh, you're obligated to keep all the law, including love your neighbor as yourself. So, being circumcised in the flesh doesn't get you an out, and doesn't get you free from the obligation of loving your neighbor as yourself. And you can, as long as you're circumcised in your flesh, you can go and you can bite your neighbor and devour your brother. No, that's what Paul is opposing in Galatians 5. That's why he brings up, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This fulfills all the law. So again, there are many other places we could go to, but again, this dichotomy really does clear up Paul's arguments. So this rivalry, this factions, this divisions, this is not what you would expect from a group sincerely devoted to Torah keeping. It is exactly what you would expect from a group whose righteousness is centered on fleshly markers and community tribalism rather than on the actual content of the law, which Paul sums up as love your neighbor as yourself. That's a quoting of Leviticus 19:18, by the way. That's not a new commandment. That's not something that Jesus brought up or invented or revealed. It's right there in the law of Moses. So let's go on to section 3, or principle 3, rather. So this explains why no one is justified by works of law. So he says this both in Romans 3:20 and he says it in Galatians 2:16. This is one of the pillars of his argument. But it has always been read in the Protestant tradition as saying something like, no amount of human moral effort can justify you before God. I believe that this reading is a serious misreading, and the reason it has persisted is precisely that the distinction between ergon nomu and to nomu, between works of law and the law, has been systematically collapsed. Once we restore this distinction, Paul's logic becomes clear. The reason no one is justified by works of law is not that human obedience in general is worthless before God. Works of law is not human effort. It's not doing things. It's not trying to be obedient. No, works of law, again, is a technical term for man-made regulations. But these particular works violate God's law and therefore cannot be a basis for righteousness. How could something that causes you to break God's commandments be reckoned as righteousness? The answer is, it can't. Paul's argument is not that the bar is too high, it is that those works are heading in the wrong direction entirely. Consider how Paul argues in Galatians 3:10 through 12. Like we mentioned before, he quotes Deuteronomy 27:26. Cursed are those who don't do the law. He quotes Habakkuk 2:4. The just shall live by faithfulness. And he quotes Leviticus 18:5. The one who does the commandments shall live in them. He links Habakkuk 2:4 and Leviticus 18:5 together using what I and other and I'm going off of the scholarship of a number of different scholars who recognize that what Paul is probably doing here is a rabbinic method of interpretation, where he's linking two passages together because they share a like term or verb. In this instance, both Habakkuk 2:4 and Leviticus 18:5 have the term, the verb shall live. And he's doing this in order to define what faithfulness is, what being of faith is. It's doing the commandments. Because if you follow the logic, works of law violate the law. Well, we know that um, that's not a faithfulness, because Leviticus 18:5 says the just shall or Leviticus 18:5 says it's he who does the commandments shall live in them, and you shall live by faithfulness. Ergo, faithfulness is doing the commandments. Ergo, works of law, which are not out of faithfulness, do not justify. That's clear-cut argument. There's really no way around that. And this principle in rabbinic interpretation is often called Gezerah Shavah, linking two passages by a shared phrase. Paul's move is not to connect justification. Paul's move is to connect justification by faithfulness in Habakkuk 2:4 with doing the commandments, Leviticus 18:5, and to set works of law as antithetical to both. In a single argument, Paul has shown that faithfulness and doing the commandments are the same thing, and that works of law stand opposed to both. Therefore, those of works of law are not of faithfulness, they are not doing the commandments, and they are under the curse of Deuteronomy 27:26. This argument only makes sense. It is only non-contradictory if works of law and doing the commandments are different and opposed things. The same logic structures Romans 2-4. Paul establishes in chapter 2 that it is the doers of the law who will be justified before God in 2:13. He gives as evidence the case of Gentiles who, though they don't have law, anarthros, which signals they don't have the Jewish halakhic tradition, nonetheless do by practice what the law requires, the Torah. They will stand at the judgment and condemn the person who boasts in law, human tradition, while transgressing the law, the Torah. Then in chapter 3, Paul states that no flesh shall be justified by works of law, ergon nomu. He then immediately says that a righteousness from God has been revealed apart from nomu, to which the law and the prophets bear witness. The two statements are not in tension. The righteousness that comes apart from man-made tradition is the very righteousness that the Torah itself has always been pointing to. The critical interpretive test, which I have posed many times in conversation and have yet to see satisfactorily answered from within the traditional reading, is this. How do you reconcile Romans 2:13 and Romans 3:20 without making Paul contradict himself? And at this point, I invite you, if you've made it to this point, leave a comment. If you believe that works of law is in relation to doing the commandments, if it has relation to the law of Moses, and they're basically the same thing, if you have a way of maintaining that conflation and not having Paul contradict himself between these two passages, I invite you to leave a comment, and I'm happy to hear it out. But from my experience, those who try to reconcile these two passages together without making a distinction between those two terms will end up explaining one or both of those passages away. Usually they'll try to explain 2:13 away. They'll take Romans 3:20 as the clear-cut statement, and then retcon Romans 2:13 to try to reconcile with that. That's not how you read an apostolic letter. That's not how you do exegesis. So if doing the law and works of law are the same thing, then Paul is affirming and denying the same proposition in back-to-back chapters. The only resolution that doesn't require you to torture one of the verses into saying something it doesn't say is to recognize that doing the law and works of law are not the same thing, and are in fact opposites in Paul's argument. So there's a further dimension of this that I think is important. The category of imputed righteousness, as formulated by the Reformed tradition, has no place in Paul's actual argument. The passages most often cited for it, Philippians 3:9, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Romans 1:17, Romans 4:3, 1 Corinthians 1:30, simply do not say what the doctrine claims they say. Romans 4 says nothing about Abraham being reckoned as righteous based on someone else's righteousness. It said Abraham believed God and trusted him, and God considered that to be righteousness. Not someone else's righteousness, not God's righteousness transferred to Abraham's account, Abraham's own righteousness, expressed through his faithfulness, demonstrated before he was circumcised. The not by works in Romans 4:2 refers to not by circumcision. I mean, that's you don't read verses like that in isolation and think just works means your own human effort, trying to do anything, trying to earn God's favor. No, works in that context is specifically in reference both before and after this verse with circumcision specifically. This dogma, this tradition of um, seeking justification through this outward mark in your flesh. So, Abraham was reckoned righteous before circumcision, so circumcision cannot be the basis of justification. It is a further irony of the Reformed framework that its doctrine of, quote, active obedience, the idea that Christ's perfect obedience to the Mosaic law is imputed to believers as the basis for their justification, actually situates justification within a works righteousness framework, just one where someone else's works form the basis. This makes Christ the ultimate legalist within a theology that claims to shun everything having to do with works of law, or following the law. So the gospel is far more glorious than that. It is not that Christ obeyed the law perfectly so that we never have to try. It is that through faith and the Spirit we are joined to him and raised to walk in newness of life, which is precisely obedience. Our assurance comes from the fact that through faith, the Spirit has united us with Christ, both in putting away the old self and in resurrection to a life of obedience unto righteousness. All right, and let's get to the last principle. Justification is by doing the law. So this one is likely to be the one that most raises eyebrows among Christians shaped by the Protestant tradition. I have argued that works of law are not the law of Moses and that they violate the law. I have argued that the reason no one is justified by works of law is precisely this violation. It follows necessarily from these arguments, and Paul states it plainly and repeatedly, that justification is by doing the law. Paul says it plainly in Romans 2:13, for it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. He says the same thing in Galatians 3:12, quoting Leviticus 18:5, the one who does the commandments shall live in them. He says it again in Romans 10:5, where, quoting the same Leviticus passage, he describes the righteousness that is of the law, or out of the law, as belonging to one who does them. He says it in 1 Corinthians 7:19. What matters is keeping the commandments of God. Now, I want to quote that passage, the entire passage, to really draw something out. The entire verse, 1 Corinthians 7:19 says, "For neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters." Um, so, if we're to read circumcision as one of the commandments of God, and that's the commandment that he's referring to with neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, then basically we have Paul contradicting himself again. He would be saying basically that the commandments of God aren't anything, but keeping the commandments of God are everything. Because if circumcision is a commandment of God and you're to be circumcised in order to be considered obedient, then he's basically contradicting himself again. But if the circumcision at a reference here in 1 Corinthians, in the context of talking to Gentiles, some who have gone through this proselyte process and have become circumcised, and others who haven't, his exhortation to both is, regardless of which one of those two states you were in when you were called, when you came to believe in Messiah, do not seek to undo that situation. If you're circumcised to become a Jew and you've gone through that process, don't seek to undo that. If you haven't gone through that process, don't seek to go through that process. Doing either of those things in Paul's rhetorical structure is a violation of God's commandments. They don't matter. What matters is doing the commandments of God. So that's the point that I wanted to make there. And our Master Yeshua says in Matthew 19:17, if you want to enter life, keep the commandments. Jesus himself says it even more sharply in Matthew 5:20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And John says it, the one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as Messiah is righteous. 1 John 3:7. These are not peripheral texts. They are not rhetorical hypotheticals. They are not texts that Paul uses only to show that the standard is impossibly high before pivoting to grace. They are statements about who will actually be declared righteous at the judgment, and they had to be taken at face value. Now, the obvious question is, doesn't Paul also say that the law is powerless to produce righteousness in us, like in Romans 8:3, and that through the law comes the knowledge of sin, Romans 3:20, and that the law kills, 2 Corinthians 3:6? Well, first off, in Romans 8:3, what Paul's talking about is that something had weakened the law and made it to where when you're not submitting to the law, which is the point of Romans 8:3-7, having your mind set on the flesh, you're under condemnation and you weaken the law. It can't produce the life that that had promised. It was weakened because you've set your mind on the flesh and you're not submitting to it. That's why he says that the mind set on the flesh does not submit to God's law and is hostile to God. But the mindset on the spirit, by correlation, is not hostile to God and does submit to God's law. It does submit to his righteousness. So that would be the point there. There's nothing wrong with the law there. It's just that when you don't submit to it, it can't produce life in you like it promises. And Romans 3:20, the actual statement there that he says that commonly gets read as through the law comes knowledge of sin. No, it's actually through nomos, through works of law, comes the experience of sin. Because again, principle number 2, works of law violates the commandments. So of course, it leads to the experience of sin. Paul in Romans 7 will mention how knowledge, being aware of what coveting is, comes when the commandment comes and says, you shall not covet. But then the other law that's at work in his members, in his flesh, springs to life. And it's this law of sin and death, this principle that takes the opportunity afforded by the commandment to produce sin and death in your members. That's what happens when you don't submit to the law of God, the law of Moses. That's the whole point. And then 2 Corinthians 3:6, no, it does not say the law kills, it says the letter kills. And again, that's grammaton. That's in reference to self-made righteousness. It leads to slavery, it leads away from the commandments, it leads to death. So this also clarifies the relationship between Paul and James, which has been a source of confusion since the Reformation. Paul and James are not teaching different things. They are making the same argument from different angles against different problems. Paul's opponents were those who sought justification through works of law, these outward marks of circumcision. James' opponents were those who claimed to have faith without the kind of practical works that the law requires, like helping the poor, loving your neighbor, things like that. Both Paul and James agree that justification involves actual righteous deeds. The only passage in all Scripture that uses the phrase faith alone is James 2:24, and it says, a man is justified by his works and not by faith alone. Instead of spending centuries explaining this verse away, we would be better served acknowledging it as part of the whole counsel of Scripture that speaks consistently about justification as involving both present reality, ongoing process, and future verdict. So the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is a decisive piece of evidence for this. The question before the council was never, should Gentiles be taught to follow the law of Moses? That was a given. Excuse me, that was a given. So much so that James' closing statement assumes that the Gentiles will be gathering in the synagogue every Sabbath to hear Moses preached. Verse 21. The question was whether circumcision, the sectarian proselytization process, was required of them in order to follow the law. The council's answer was no. It was not a decision against Torah observance. I mean, the four requirements James gives as the initial non-negotiable stipulations are themselves drawn directly from Leviticus 17 and 18. Dealing with ritual purity so that the Gentiles could be in unity and fellowship with Jewish believers. The decision of the council assumed, from top to bottom, that the Gentile believers would be learning and keeping the law of Moses. So we get to our conclusion. The four arguments I have laid out here form a coherent whole. Works of law are man-made oral traditions and sectarian regulations, specifically the practice of requiring Gentile converts to be ritually circumcised to become Jews, that are not found in the law of Moses. These works of law do not merely fail to justify, they actively lead people to violate the very law they claim to uphold, by building a dividing wall that God never erected and inventing a righteousness that God never commanded. Because they violate the law, they cannot be a basis for righteousness, and no one is justified by them, not because God requires the impossible from human beings, but because these particular practices are heading in exactly the wrong direction. Justification, by contrast, is by doing the law. The doers of the law will be justified, and this doing is identical with faithfulness, with trust in the one who justifies, expressed through obedience worked in us by the Spirit. I believe this reading is the only one that allows Romans 2:13 and Romans 3:20 to stand side by side without contradiction. It is the only one that takes Galatians 3:10 through 12 seriously on its own terms. It is the only one that makes sense of why Paul's opponents, the circumcision party, are described in Titus 1:6 through 16 as arrogant, violent, greedy, devoted to Jewish myths and commands of men, and utterly disobedient. People seriously committed to Torah observance do not fit that description. Sectarian proselytizers who have invented their own righteousness do. None of this undermines the beloved principle that salvation comes through faith and grace, but it deeply reframes what that means. The false choice between faith and works, between grace and law, is a construction of Western, Augustinian, and ultimately Greek theological categories being imposed on Paul's very Jewish arguments. Once we let go of it, we see that the gospel Paul proclaimed was precisely the good news that Gentiles, without becoming Jews, had been brought near to the covenants and promises given to Israel, had received the circumcision of the heart through the Spirit by faith, and were now called to the obedience of faithfulness, learning and keeping the law of God alongside their Jewish brothers and sisters in the synagogues, as citizens of the commonwealth of Israel. That was the scandal. That was the good news, and it is still good news today. And that concludes the presentation. Again, I hope that those four principles, that you will take them to heart, that you'll take them to Paul's corpus and begin reading in light of those four principles, and see if you come to the conclusion, as I have, and as many scholars in the Paul Within Judaism vein of scholarship are coming to, that Paul's polemics against works of law had nothing to do with doing the commandments of God, or doing them wrong, or doing them too much, or or fixating on them or trying to earn your salvation, stuff like that. Though that's the wrong grid. It's the wrong apologetic. I'll put it that way. So with that, I pray that that has blessed you, and that you continue to grow and refine your own exegetics with Paul. It's very important that we understand his writings and his theology correctly. So with that, shalom to you all. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Hey folks, if you enjoyed this episode and the content, please like the video and leave a comment below, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can be sure to catch more content like this as it comes. Until next time, think deep.